Hello, I am Riley E. Smith, author and bibliophile. This is my co-host Lyle the Pitbull, and today we're going to be talking about classics. Please excuse my co-host's many silly noises. He's very bored. He hates when I pay attention to anything that is not him. I feel like with classic literature, we're given a lot of ideas and suppositions around the book before we even pick it up. And what do I mean by classics? So to me, a classic is very old, very well written. At the very least, the language is beautiful. Your brain feels good when you read those words. These are books that you might have been told to read in school or in college, perhaps. Barnes & Noble gives them specifically this style of printing. It says Barnes & Noble Classics. That's a classic. Obviously, this list is flexible. We could argue about what books technically belong on them or not. But if they're over 100 years old and most people would recognize the name, it's probably a classic. Maybe I'm overestimating how many people recognize book titles. But I feel like the ones I grabbed here today are not obscure. Although I think one is less than 100 years old, so I guess it doesn't have to be 100 years old to be a classic. There's classics from, like, the last century. Anyway, that's my general idea of what a classic is. And I feel like when we're taught about these books in school, or just when they come up in pop culture, when they come up in other media, there's a lot of suppositions. There's a lot of, oh, this book is like this, or this means this. Gatsby's green light stands for XYZ. We're given these kind of imposed impressions of the books before you even open up and read them. There's a lot of books that you probably kind of feel like you've read without even grabbing it or seeing it. To use an example from theater, most of us probably feel like we have a good concept of Romeo and Juliet. How many of us have actually sat down to read it? Or even seen a full production of Romeo and Juliet, right? How many of us have sat down to see a full play of Hamlet, a full play of Macbeth? But we still have an idea about these texts because they're in the pop culture. So I thought it would be interesting, because I've been reading a lot of, like, classics lately. My dog is really enjoying his treat. I hope you enjoy the dog ASMR in the back of this video. I've been reading a lot of classics. I found it interesting with a lot of these books that they were very different than I had kind of been led to believe they would be. For one reason or another, I had been given an impression of the book, and the book itself was very different. I thought this was interesting because it's not always the case. When I read Madame Bovary, that was a book about a woman in the French countryside who's bored with her life and bored with the man she decided to marry. Obviously, there's a lot going on there, but it's about ennui. And I kind of got what I expected from it. Same with the first time I read Pride and Prejudice. I had an expectation of wit and humor with a little bit of drama and, some Pride and some Prejudice. And Jane Austen's sense of humor. These were books where I had a conception of the book before I read it, and the book kind of went along with that conception. The ones I want to share today did not. So let's get into it. The first one I want to talk about, I actually read, just finished. I just finished it a couple weeks ago, maybe. Took me a little while to get all the way through it, not because I wasn't enjoying it, but because of what surprised me about it. So Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I hear he's big with the kids these days. I'm here for it. I'm happy about it. I've mentioned Dostoevsky on this channel before. I just finished Crime and Punishment, and I think, what I was expecting about it was I knew it would be introspective. I knew there would be existential crises abounding. I knew there would be deep portrayals of ideologies and how those connect with mental health at this period in time. I knew there would be depictions of different classes, of social classes of people in Russia at the time. I expected introspection, philosophy. What I did not expect was at the chapter ends to be gasping, literally like, like some of the things that happened or like the tension. Because this book was, like a lot of books at the time, published as a serial. It was also published because Dostoevsky needed money. He very much had it in mind that he needed some cash when he wrote this book. And gosh darn it if I was not riveted by the drama. It's such an incredible, deep, philosophical, thoughtful novel, and it is also the best soap opera that I have seen recently. The drama of the chapter ends and cutoff points are pretty wild, and a lot of the tension is pretty crazy. So I didn't expect that, actually. I knew I was in for something introspective about good and evil and all of these big concepts, but I did not realize that I was in for such a drama. I think one interesting aspect that I again did not expect is Dostoevsky goes to great lengths at the beginning of the novel to make it clear that his protagonist is young and handsome. He's a good-looking lad. He is an attractive young man. He is a proper leading gentleman. All I'm saying is that if Tumblr had existed when Crime and Punishment came out, you would have been seeing some disturbingly explicit Raskolnikov fan art. And that's where I'm gonna leave that. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm saying that's what would have happened. The next one I want to talk about is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. This is a big boy. I have actually read this. I've actually read the whole thing. What's commonly published as Don Quixote now is actually 2 books, which is something I did not expect. You would think they would split it up because it's massive. The first book feels finished when it's done, so you get like halfway through whatever giant text you're holding, and it's done. Cervantes actually wrote the second book because people were writing sequels. People were writing Don Quixote fan fiction. So that's one thing that surprised me, is that this is actually 2 books, and Cervantes wrote the second one because people were writing Don Quixote fan fiction, and he wanted to make it clear what actually happened to Don Quixote, and to basically make fun of the people who were writing their own versions of the story and shit on them, basically. He like starts out by ranting really hard at this guy who was claiming to write the true story of Don Quixote after the events of the first book. It's pretty clear that Cervantes wanted the first book to like end there, but then people kept writing shit, so he felt like he had to do more, which is very funny. So that surprised me. I didn't realize it's 2 books, which makes sense because it's freaking massive. The other thing that I was surprised about, and maybe shouldn't have been, but it's really funny. The book is a satire, like, totally. I think that's something that is communicated but not focused on a lot when we talk about it. But it is just making fun of guys fanboying about knightly myths, about knights and squires and that whole thing. It's just like a relentless mocking of people romanticizing the medieval period, essentially, which in the 1600s, you know, it's kind of faded out, all that chivalry stuff. So I didn't expect it to be as funny as it is. I think it is communicated that it is a satire, but not that it's just so darn funny. Like, there's a lot of events and lines in it that are very silly. Quixote and Sancho Panza are comic figures, which maybe does not surprise you. And obviously, like, Quixote and Sancho Panza inspired a lot of comic figures and were inspired by comic figures, so I don't know. I guess, like, a lot of times people act like classics have to be really dramatic, and we act like if something is funny, then that somehow makes it lesser, and that annoys me. So I feel like I just really want to point out that this is a very funny book, even if it is massive. The next book that kind of surprised me, actually surprised me more the second time that I read it. It is Siddhartha by Herman Hesse. I'm sure I'm going to annoy some of you with this opinion, but the second time that I read this, now in my late 20s, really pushing 30 over here, that I read this book. The first time I read it in high school, I really loved it. I was just taken away, and I read it and probably reread it, or at least reread parts of it, and was talking about it with my friends. We read it for school, for class, and I was just enraptured by this story of this person's like personal discovery of spirituality and of themselves. When I read it again recently, hopefully meaning that I'm more mature, I did not enjoy it. It seems very self-serving to me to make a character who has the same name as the earthly name of the Buddha, and to have him go on a life journey that is very similar to the journey of the Buddha, to go and actually meet the Buddha and talk to him, and then to have your main character walk away with what is described as a better understanding of life and spirituality. To have your character go through all that and literally meet the Buddha, and then to walk away and be like, but, you know, my understanding of the world and the self is even better than that, guys. That is kind of wild to me. It feels very Western. It feels very Western to take like this much of a book to talk about Eastern principles and to just determine at the end of it that you know it better than anyone else and that your version of everything is better. I did like it the first time that I read it, but after decades of hopefully growth and also reading about Eastern religions, like I'm not an expert by any means, but that's what I'm saying. It's so weird that there's like one short conversation in here with the Buddha, and then the main character is just like, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And it's just so much less satisfying to read this very westernized version, this like amalgamation of Western philosophy, of self-involvement and Buddhism that's like being done here. It's just leaves me with a bad taste in my mouth nowadays. I felt like I got a lot more out of actually reading about Zen. I know that's very different than a lot of Buddhism. I really don't know anything about Buddhism, but the fact that me reading this in high school made me feel like I was understanding Eastern religion and coming away with a more full idea of it in my own version is weird. I guess what it comes down to is that the journey the main character takes in this feels so very self-involved that it is no longer interesting to me. I don't know, yell at me in the comments. Tell me that I don't understand difficult concepts or philosophy or good books. Go ahead. I don't even care anymore. It's just weird to me to take the story of the Buddha as a Western man and then write a self-insert where you are the Buddha, but cooler and smarter. Just feels weird to me. So the next one is not literary fiction, as opposed to, I would say the first ones we've talked about have all been literary fiction. Don Quixote is also satire, but I definitely think you would still call it literary fiction if you consider something from the 1600s to be able to be classified by modern genre conventions. Anyway, this next one is very much not literary fiction. However, I do think you will not begrudge me calling it a classic. It is the Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales by the Brothers Grimm. I have this fantastic edition. I got this in high school. I read the shit out of it. In high school, I was very much obsessed with anything that I felt like was a drawing myth that other stories and things were kind of pulling from. So I was very much obsessed with mythology, obsessed with any mythology that I could find and read about. That definitely included fairy tales. So Grimm's complete fairy tales, here's what surprised me about these when I read them. Most of these fairy tales you have probably heard of, and even heard versions. They are very different. The Grimm version is probably very different than the version you have in your head. A lot of the stories are more disturbing. Sometimes they're just more disjointed and weird. I feel like we have definitely sanitized and logicified a lot of these stories because we have a more strict idea, I feel like, of what is allowed to constitute a story anymore. Probably because we have such strict conventions over like what a movie can look like and things like that. So I was actually very surprised. If you've never picked up Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales, please don't consider it just, oh, well, I know those. You know, they're in the cultural subconscious. Like, I know those already. It's really interesting to see where our understanding of a story culturally has differed from the way that somebody like Grimm wrote them down. Obviously, the Grimm fairy tales are not the first version or the definitive version by any means. They were writing down stories that they found. So these already existed, probably in a multitude of forms. I think looking at the forms that the Grimm brothers wrote down and seeing those extant stories and how they look compared to the idea we have now of the fairy tale is very interesting. It's something I really recommend for writers, especially if you're looking to fill your creative well. You know, check it out. I will say the Grimm ones surprised me a lot more than, say, when I read Edith Hamilton's mythology. Yes, I was one of those kids, surprising no one. When I read Greek and Roman mythology, nothing about that really shocked me. It kind of went with the idea of what I had been given. Maybe I didn't expect Hera to try to strangle babies with snakes. But what I had heard about Greek myths meshed fairly well. Obviously not with the Hercules Disney movie, lol. But my conception of what Greek myths would be like was pretty much what reading the book was like. That is not the case when I read Grimm's fairy tales. It was very different than the notion I had of these stories going in. The fifth one I am reading right now, I actually do not have a physical copy. I'm reading it on my Nook, okay? I have a very old Nook that actually is not supported anymore, and that is what I am reading it on, because I am a grandmother and I refuse to get anything newer. I am reading Moby Dick by Herman Melville. A couple of things have been very interesting to me about this so far. I'm almost 200 pages in of like the 500 something book. It's really funny. Again, I feel like this even more so than Don Quixote, because you would at least been like kind of aware that Don Quixote is a satire. That you're kind of given that. You knew there was going to be funny something in there, right? My impression of Don Quixote was that it was going to have a little more pathos in it, but it is biting satire in my opinion. Very pointed. And Sancho Panza is just funny. He's so funny. Moby Dick is hilarious. Ishmael is a silly guy. I in no way think that this degrades the book or makes it less interesting. I think it adds so much to it. Ishmael says that he's basically doing this because he's just bored and he likes to travel, but he doesn't want to have to pay to travel. So he signs up as a whaler. There's several hilarious moments of he spends a lot of time telling you that he's not expecting to get too big of a cut of the whaling because everybody on board splits the profits. Very cool. Profit sharing. We love it. He's not expecting to get too big of a cut because he doesn't have experience as a whaler. He expects to be basically what amounts to the 270th person to get a cut. So that's gonna be the smallest cut. And he says he wouldn't be offended by that. Anything less would be insulting. And then the person he's talking to comes back and offers him the 777th cut. So 500 portions less than, like, he was expecting. And so he had just, like, set up, like, how insulting, unfathomably insulting it would be to get anything less than $2.75. And then he gets offered $7.77. And that is so effing funny. It is such a, like, kick to the nards. There are parts of the book that are just phenomenally dramatic. He also just takes whole chapters to just, like, talk about random whale things. Like, I know we shouldn't diagnose people in other times because context matters so much for mental illness. Like, things that are considered a mental illness today are not going to be considered at all the same way 20 years from now, I hope. Because context, it's about how you move within the society that you're in. However, Herman Melville writes about whales like he's ADHD and has a hyperfixation. Like, he just, all of a sudden we have a chapter where he's just classifying whales. And it's like, I was here to hunt a white whale with y'all. We're not doing that at all. We're talking about biology and how they don't really have any biological knowledge at this point. It's all like hearsay and some trying to see the whale. It's relatable because I feel like my videos where I talk about things I'm really passionate about sound like Herman Melville suddenly dropping off to, like, give a speech about whale, like, in the middle of this narrative. He's like, I know that you want, like, this high-octane tale on the high seas, but let me talk to you a little bit about whale oil and the social ramifications of the distribution of whale oil. It's amazing. And it's just very funny. I think, like, there's so many things about Moby Dick that we were informed were, like, these amazingly deep, dramatic metaphors. One example that I distinctly remember is a teacher in school or a worksheet or something pointing out to me, we didn't actually read Moby Dick. We just used examples of the metaphors as examples of metaphors when we were learning about metaphor. But I remember somebody pointing out to me and to the class that a man comes along in the street and basically tries to warn Ishmael about Captain Ahab, and that man is named Elijah. Elijah is a prophet from the Bible. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, that's the name of a prophet from the Bible, okay? It's a prophetic name. So a man named Elijah comes up to him in the street, but this man Elijah is acting like just a crazy guy on the street. But he's being so, like, silly about it. Like, he runs up and he's like, oh, going with Ahab, are ye? You're doomed for the bottom of the sea. Like, and then Ishmael's like, what are you talking about? And Elijah's like, oh, Ahab is crazy. Like, he's basically blatantly saying it, but he's saying it in these, like, little riddles and jokes. Like, it's amazing. It's a fantastic scene. You should read Moby Dick and tell me what you think. It's a surprisingly funny book. It is cracking me up. Melville's passion for the minutiae of whales is amazing. And it's very funny. The way that he writes and the situations that he sets up. It's very interesting that the character of Ishmael and how he kind of goes about the world is very silly and funny. And then Ahab has absolutely rancid vibes. Ahab is a dark hole of problem. And I feel like that becomes much more poignant to me when juxtaposed with the silly way that Ishmael usually sees his life and talks about the world. So, I think by forgetting that Moby Dick is very funny a lot of the time, you really lose out on something in the book. Which is why I'm telling you, Moby Dick is a funny book. Thus far, 200 pages in. It might be that Ahab's vibes are so rancid, it's going to affect the rest of the book and make it not funny. That is entirely possible, and I would respect that choice on Melville's part. But we shall see. Maybe I'll do a longer breakdown of Moby Dick whenever I'm finished with it. What are some classics of literature that surprised you, for good or for ill? I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe for more videos about books. I do a lot of book content. I also talk about Cartoons. I do a lot of things about classic cartoons. So cartoons done in the golden age of Hollywood, usually between the years 1930 and 1970 with a little bit of wiggle room. Most of what I talk about is between like the 30s and the 60s. I have a huge video on Bugs Bunny that I'm working on. It's gonna be like a 3-hour deep dive into the history of Bugs Bunny, so looking forward to that. So make sure you like the video and subscribe so you don't miss out. Thank you so much for watching, and I guess I'm gonna go keep reading Moby Dick and see if my opinion changes. Bye!